What ends up happening, though, is that Christianity, even though many of the Roman emperors are persecuting the Christians and trying to destroy the Christians and driving the Christians underground, the Christian culture for the first couple hundred years to almost 300 years is developing as revolutionary identity culture against the imperial nature of Rome itself. By the time we get to the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire had really included about 5 million Christians, which was 1/10 of the population of Rome in itself. And in 312, Constantine ultimately won a decisive battle after claiming to have seen a vision and then having his troops decorate the shield with crosses. And then in 313, Constantine would issue the Edict of Milan, which guaranteed religious freedom to all, ending religious persecution in the Roman Empire. Constantine's predecessors, Diocletian, who reigned from 284 to 305 CE, he saw Christianity as a direct threat to his authority. Diocletian had initiated an 8-year persecution in 303, in which numerous Christians were martyred, which increased rather than diminished the number of the faithful. And then, therefore, when Constantine came to power in 306, he inherited a Rome that was, again, 1/10 population in Christianity. Constantine's victory was celebrated in the usual style. His victory on the Milvian Bridge and his conversion to Christianity, and then the basic conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, was celebrated in this, the Arch of Constantine. This impressive triple arch, which is different than many of them. And then the arch's reliefs provide insight into the profound changes in the art and culture of this period that the Christian faith ultimately inspired. And particularly things such as naturalism was no longer an important aim of art. Rather, the symbolic function of art ultimately dominates. Constantine, as an emperor, he recognized, for example, the merit of Diocletian's splitting of the empire into 2 administrative camps, one in Rome and then one in the Greek city of Byzantium. And then in 1325, he convened the First Ecumenical Council, in which he established an Orthodox creed that would ultimately unify Christian practice and belief throughout the empire. And it was known as the Nicene Creed. And by the way, one of the things that Constantine did as well was to engage in great architectural projects, just as his predecessors had done, only that now these were done under the aegis of Christianity. These, for example, were the bronze horses that were installed in the Hippodrome, which is as I say here, the entertainment complex in Byzantium that matches a Roman Circus Maximus. In 325, Constantine convened the Ecumenical Council, and they established the Nicene Creed. This was a very important point here, particularly because the Nicene Council did very many things at this moment. They codified, actually, the Christian Bible along with the New Testament. They created the Nicene Creed. They codified many of the very tenets of Christianity. This ultimately would become practice and belief throughout the empire. What Constantine did was not just merely to tell people to just think about creating books, but rather he had them put down the very laws and essence of what would become the religious dogma and doxology of Christianity itself. It was known that the Nicene Creed laid out the fundamental tenets of Christian theology regarding things such as the Trinity, the virgin birth, and the coming of judgment of both living and dead. And St. Jerome established the text of the first Bible, translating the Old Testament from Hebrew. And then he created a Latin Bible that would be the standard Bible in the medieval world for over 1,000 years. But by the year 410, while Constantine had built up a new empire on the basis of this religion, by the year 410, the Roman Empire itself was completely crumbled. St. Augustine, not unlike the city in Florida, ultimately lives to actually see the destruction of Rome, and he sees this as the heavenly destruction of earthly power. Augustine, within this period, writes important books, such as The City of God and the Confessions. They were importantly influential on the philosophy of the early medieval period. A couple of things ended up happening, of course. The church would adapt itself to its cultural surroundings, while Rome itself fell. But by 410 CE, Visigoths would sack Rome. In 476, Odoacer, who was a Germanic king, he ultimately would name himself King of Italy and sack Rome. And then 493 CE, Theodoric, the Ostrogoth king, and also Christian, he would sack Rome and then ultimately take over from Odoacer as well. The point here is that Rome started to become a place in which, as its infrastructure crumbled, so too then its seat began to be taken away from it. And the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine right here, which I'm trying to point out, is a part of this history, because it's really the last of the great imperial buildings that were erected in Rome. Constantine, of course, had added an imposing entrance and the apse, which is the rounded extension. And so the Basilica plan, with the apse as its focal point, this would exert considerable influence on later Christian churches. My point here then is to begin to talk about the relationship not between the socio-political government, but also the relationship between the church, the government, and also the creation of a whole new artistic structure from the fallen ends of the Roman Empire, leading into this period of late antiquity. And the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine demonstrate, the desire to do that. The basilica itself then became the central church plan for the medieval period. For example, take a look at this right here, which is the reconstruction drawing and plan of Old St. Peter's. Notice, for instance, how in the plan we can see how the basilica design from this slide becomes to be a part of the new church, the large nave structure with the barreled vaulted arches on the side here in this case as well. Here in this rendering, we would get this structure. And so again, let's go back to this one. St. Peter's Basilica, for example, which was begun under Constantine in 320, it sits on the site supposedly of Peter's crucifixion and his tomb in Rome. What this begins to show us that in churches, for instance, such as the Church of St. Costanza, this period of late antiquity is beginning to apply a particular type of structure to its architecture. So, for example, in this case, this particular church was conceived as a mausoleum, the Church of St. Costanza. It's a domed structure, a circular structure that's topped by a dome in this case, as you can see in the picture. It's got a double ring, paired columns, in which it's got the ambulatory space or the walkway that surrounds the outside. And the point here is that along with St. Peter's Basilica and also, for instance, the Church of St. Constanza, later Christian churches would adopt these kinds of architectural structures, the apse, the ambulatory, the narthex here, and the columns as such. And what this really brings us to, what we're seeing with the development of, or rather with the establishment of Christianity under Constantine, is the turning over of the ancient pagan world in such a way as to remake not just merely its religion, but also its idols, and also its architecture, and also its art in this new religion. Christianity has to be understood, particularly of this period of what we're calling late antiquity. The development of Christianity has to be understood as, the development of a syncretic religion. So, in other words, as the early Christian churches developed from existing Roman plans, the religion itself started to incorporate many Greek and Roman traditions, and that's what's known as syncretism. So, for example, from the cult of Bacchus came the idea of the sacrifice, with a promise of a reborn for eternity for whoever received the sacrifice's blood. In this case, it would be a bull's blood. And this ritual occurred near the beginning of the Christian Easter religions as well. From the cult of Isis, which is what this particular figure demonstrates, we see the image of the mother and her child, Horus in this case, which becomes possible inspiration for depictions of the Madonna enthroned, the Virgin and the Child in Christian art. But we also get Mithraic reliefs here, and the development of another cult that shares the same kind of syncretic relationship with Christianity. For instance, the cult of Mithra, which developed originally in Persia and became popular with Roman troops. The story of Mithra is that he appears to have been based on the teachings of Zoroaster, who lived about from between 1000 and the early 7th century BCE. Another thing here is that birthday of Mithra is celebrated each year on December 25th. And Mithraism shared many ritual practices with Christianity. Baptism, periods of fasting, communal meals of bread and wine, and sacrifice for the good of humanity. And so in remaking the ancient world, and in remaking and getting rid of and dealing with the cultic religions of the ancient Greco-Roman world, Christianity began to consume those religions, began to syncretize those images into its own structure. And it began to spread rather rapidly. And in this particular map, by the time we get to 600 Common Era, Christianity has spread and expanded all throughout those Roman provinces, all the way into Persia just as much. I mean, it literally took over the old Roman Empire. And as such, it also began to incorporate the flavors of the different religions and varieties of different peoples into it as a structure. Christianity was a religion that was built on, because of its persecution, it was built on being a revolutionary underground religion, which had to rely on symbols in order to communicate with different members, who were outlaws until Constantine made it legal. But as it also became a legal state religion, Christianity then had to contend with its pagan past, and also take that and transform the pagans ultimately into something different. And so the symbols of Christianity itself, things such as this slide with the Alpha and the Omega and the Chi and the Rho, demonstrate that the early Christians, they lived in a mainly pagan and hostile society. For example, during Nero's persecution of their religion, he considered it a strange and illegal superstition. Christians were mistrusted and kept aloof. They were suspected and accused of the worst crimes. As I said before, they were persecuted in prison, they were sent into exile, or condemned to death. And oftentimes, unable to profess their faith openly, they made use of these symbols, which they depicted on the walls of catacombs and carved on marble slabs, and also on sarcophagi. And like the very ancients, Christians themselves were fond of symbolism. And the symbols were a visible reminder of their faith. And so the term symbol actually refers to the concrete sign or figure, for example, the Chi-Rho here, or the Alpha Omega in this particular one, which according to the author's intention recalls an idea or spiritual reality. The monogram of Christ is formed by interlacing the two letters of the Greek alphabet, Chi and Rho, together. And that's the first two words of the word Christos, or Christ. And so when this monogram would be placed on a tombstone, it meant a Christian was buried there. And so, again, the Alpha and the Omega here, these would be put on things and would designate what and where Christians were and who they were. And early Christians began to incorporate many symbols into their work. And so, contrary to Roman art, this early Paleo-Christian art isn't realistic and doesn't try to represent reality as it is. Take, for instance, the figure here. It looks more like a cartoon than it does, some of the other types of reliefs. But that wasn't the issue. What characterizes it is its religious symbolism.